Yes. That to be the next one.
Today, I'm visiting Stinson Elementary, one of the elementary schools here on the east side, to sit in on a PACE class. If you're wondering what that fancy acronym means,
PACE stands for Plano's Academic and Creative Education, and what is designed to do is to extend learning for kids that need gifted services.
To get a better idea of what PACE means to the kids it affects, I'll let them tell you.
My favorite thing about PACE is that we get to feel free, and that most in the classes we all have to follow these instructions, and we do in PACE here, but also we get to pick how we get to design our things, and we get to have a little more freedom in the classroom.
My favorite thing about PACE would be that in regular classrooms, people are a little under our level, so that in PACE we have everybody on our level, so everybody will understand each other.
The structure in a PACE class is a little different than a typical classroom. The teachers try to make room for more creative thinking, like in this exercise.
We're going to do a flexibility activity right now. So go ahead and open up your spiral, and I want you to brainstorm just things that are in your mind right now, like topics or just things.
Okay, so everything in my list is related in some way. So my first one would be NTCC, music, Miss Nolasco, High Hopes, Happier by Marshmallows, hot chocolate, Nutella, breakfast, eggs, Eggos, egging someone's house, Halloween, Donald Trump, President, Obama, Washington, Revolutionary War, Social Studies, Miss Loam, sickness, flu, Zika virus, mosquito bites, Jumanji, video games, and Fortnite.
If you know what PACE is, or you've listened to this podcast before, or just looked at the title, then you might guess that this isn't just a class students opt into. There's an entire process required to be a part of this class, including a variety of factors such as cognitive testing, parent or teacher recommendation, and non-traditional identification.
There's a whole cottage industry around test prepping for these standardized tests. So here's what research shows us though, is you can test prep the student on a test with the same format, but when they sit in front of a test that's formatted the same but the content is different, we're not noticing a huge difference in scores.
PACE is just one iteration of the larger umbrella of curriculum designed for gifted and talented, or GT, students. But what does it mean to be gifted and talented?
Heck, I mean, that goes back to 1972 when they first coined it and this country decided to start recognizing it.
So they come up with out of the box kind of thinking, and that's the whole point of it.
Unfortunately, I think what the label has become for those outside of the community is simply a way to show that your kid is smart.
Today on the podcast, we explore the GT label, what it looks like in PISD, and how it affects critical components of learning, such as risk-taking and creativity. I'm Abby Blasingame, and from Pesh Prince, this is Testing Boundaries.
So last week we talked about whether or not we thought we did a thumbs up, thumbs down, and about where we thought our most creative time in our life so far for you guys, Kate, all the way up through 5th grade. And what did we kind of conclude? That creativity increases with age or decreases?
Decreases.
And what did we kind of attribute that to? Adulting, yeah, like real life.
The day I visited this PACE class, they were discussing creativity, which happens to be one of the core components of giftedness and a gifted education.
My name's Teresa Biggs. I'm Director of Advanced Academics for Plano. Just that term creative is a little dicey because some people hear creative and they think artistic. And when we're talking about creative, we're talking about the ability to think creatively. So you can have creative thinking in the way a student puts together an essay, or the way a student just articulates a certain concept. It's not necessarily about poster board and paints and creating art, although art is certainly creative, and you may want to implement that into some of the work you do. We're really talking about creative thinkers, so it's more about that than it is about artistic types of products.
Okay, I'm Heather Brzezinski, a gifted specialist at Stints Elementary.
And when I asked her what made her students unique, her answer went back to this idea of creativity.
Just the way they make connections. Some of the things they say that I'm anticipating, it's not even in the realm of their. So they come up with out of the box kind of thinking, and that's the whole point of it. And then sometimes I see gaps too, where they don't know maybe common vocab, and I think it's just exposure. But then they'll have these amazing connections between curricular areas or just life. But that's probably it. Their thinking process and the way they share it.
So your accelerated learner benefits from gifted services because it usually extends the challenge for them. Not always. And definitely your creative thinker, it's all about that. How does the student learn differently? It's really special education in a lot of ways at the other end of the spectrum. We're talking about different learners. For example, you can have a kid in PACE who may not be knocking A's out of the park. They may not be the valedictorian, the salutatorian, but they might be a highly creative thinker that needs that type of learning, that just chooses not to participate in certain academic assignments because he or she doesn't feel it's worth their while. Which, of course, we would hope they would feel that, but you'll see kids, sometimes you'll look at grades and you'll see kids with grades that are not as high as you would imagine in a gifted course, but a lot of times it's the choice that student is making, but there's still that type of thinker that benefits from the education that happens in a gifted program.
My name is Rami Mahmood. I am the Science Department Chair at Williams High School. So I actually avoid looking for knowing which of my kids are actually GT and which ones aren't. I do teach pre-AP biology, so I have quite a few GT students in my classes, but I don't initially know who they are. And it's actually pretty surprising by the time I actually do take the time to look at the data. Kids that I would be absolutely certain should be GT aren't labeled as GT. And then there are some that really surprise me. So the label itself at this age, I don't think is an indicator of how successful they're going to be in my class, or how likely they are to follow instructions or do things like that. I think it's simply a marker that's been established throughout their academic career.
These gaps have a likely explanation. Most tests later in life, like the ACT, examine a defined set of skills such as geometry and grammar. But to identify how students think at an age when some can't even read requires a much different process.
And what's really interesting about just giftedness is we know that science definitely tells us that students that are gifted are born with a gifted brain. It's a biological, physiological phenomena, but we also know that based on the experiences a student has, that giftedness may not bubble up for years. So it's kind of a hyperbolic example, but if you were born with a gift for music, but you lived in a country that had no musical instruments, that may not serve as you may not know. So you think about a child possibly that's born into a situation where they're not exposed to a lot of academic experiences, a child from poverty that maybe doesn't have the ability to go to the museums or to see plays or kind of really foster his intellectual ability. It may not pop up until later. They may need time in school to allow that giftedness to really pop up. But an important distinction that I think is really important is when we assess kids, we're not saying necessarily that students are gifted or not. We're really trying to determine if they need the gifted services we offer. So you could have a child that's gifted in art. Well, we're not going to put that child in PACE. Those aren't the services we offer. So it's very much about, does the student need the gifted services we offer? The state requires that we use standardized test scores. We have to use achievement scores, which are MAP scores. We have to use ability scores, and in Plano, that's COGAT. And then the state also requires we have qualitative data. So that's where we're really looking at what does student work look like when they do produce work? What does the teacher see that maybe doesn't show up in a standardized test? Parent input, what are parents seeing at home that we may not be seeing on the campus? And it looks a little bit different when you're looking at elementary kids and you're looking at secondary kids, but can even be things like at the elementary level. This wouldn't be the one reason to place, but something like, okay, we need to pay attention to this kid. If a teacher says something in the class and, she's kind of above grade level, or be the kind of joke that maybe an adult would get and a student wouldn't get, and then you hear a second grader laugh and get that joke, well, you may have an accelerated learner there. You may have someone who's operating several grade levels above their peers. So you just want to pay attention to that. Things that, and I'm thinking now mostly elementary, middle school, the students that always want to talk to the teacher and don't want to talk to their peers, and they stay after class or they come before class and they always want to talk to the adults. It may be, not always, but it may be that the adult in the room is the closest to them in intellectual level. So that might be an indicator. So there are a lot of these small little indicators and flags that would make a teacher kind of hone in and dig a little bit deeper and see what's going on in that kid's mind.
Let me give you an even more specific and personal example about how I got identified as a possible GT student. Because, full disclosure, I was a student in Miss Brzezinski's PACE class. When I was in kindergarten, my whole class was given a sheet of paper with squiggles on it and told to complete the picture and write a story about it. While most kids drew a worm or a snake, I drew a magical musical instrument and came up with a story about a band.
That's a great example. That's qualitative data we use. So at every grade level in elementary, we have those types, they're called planned experiences written to the elementary curriculum. And we have about 2 or 3 that happen in the fall semester that every student in Plano does at the elementary level, and they kind of act as screeners to help flag kids that might need gifted services.
The identification process itself is one of the most controversial parts of the GT label. While the Washington Post reported that screening tools such as the drawings we just mentioned significantly reduce factors such as wealth and race in determining the likelihood of a child to be identified as GT, other concerns around teaching to the test and the weight parents put on the GT label have been raised. One person raising these concerns is Mahmoud, who wrote an opinion piece in the Dallas Morning News headlined, "How the Gifted and Talented Label Could Sink Your Child's Chance of Success." However, it should be noted that he didn't write the headline part of the article, so I'll give him a chance to sum it up in his own words.
The majority of the article is really talking about the label of gifted and talented and how the GT label and the purpose of GT is seen really differently whether you're in the educational community or whether you're part of the community in general. Gifted students are, they should be categorized as students with special needs. And I don't mean that in a negative connotation at all. Like, my wife took a course in college called Exceptional Children, and I love the name of the course because that was the representation of any student who would benefit from having some assistance or some added resources to help them be successful in the classroom. And it included the whole range, both from the low end and for the kids that could benefit from having a little more challenge. So really, the GT programs throughout our educational community is meant to provide a place for the kids who aren't being challenged enough to get the opportunity to really push themselves and grow. Unfortunately, I think what the label has become for those outside of the community is simply a way to show that your kid is smart, or a way to show that your kid is special. And I think maybe the push from some parents is to want their kids to be labeled GT simply to be able to say that my kid's GT, and maybe to be able to have that to be something to be proud of as a parent. Like, that makes you a good parent if your kid can be labeled GT. And that kind of push, I think, from an early age is unfortunate because it puts a certain standard on the kids, and it teaches a lot of the kids to maybe act a certain way for a certain purpose. And rather than simply enjoying the process of learning and growing academically, there are a lot of pressures that are now placed on you as a learner, whether you've already been labeled as GT or whether your parents are really wanting you to be labeled as GT. It changes the way you see what you do every day in the classroom.
There's a whole cottage industry around test prepping for these standardized tests. So here's what research shows us, though, is you can test prep a student, and it seems to be out there primarily for elementary students and the moms of elementary students that are involved with this, is you can test prep the student on a test with the same format, but when they sit in front of a test that's formatted the same but the content is different, we're not noticing a huge difference in scores. We don't see a huge skew all of a sudden. The problem is if anyone gets a hold of one of the actual tests we give, right, when that opens a whole new set of problems, that's when we have issues. But there's really no way to police that.
It isn't necessarily the idea of non-GT students being placed in an advanced classroom that worries people like Mahmood. It's the idea that the constant pressure for perfection discourages risk-taking and thus endangers students' educational experience.
It's not a new concept. It's just the pendulum has shifted back to where it's fallen off. And I was telling Abby earlier, the things that have changed that I've seen as a PACE teacher, just PACE kids in general, actually all kids in general, even my daughter, and she's only 7.5, is that her generation, they were willing to take more risks. They were okay making mistakes. And now, a lot of people, let's just show of hands if you're comfortable with it, how many of you are not, you want to make sure before you offer in class, whether it's PACE or regular classroom, how many of you are like hesitant to share if you don't know the answer 100%? Exactly.
It's moving towards more of simply who's good at taking tests, and that same kind of pressure and being taught that same way from early on really is teaching a certain lesson to kids, and I think it definitely can hinder them as they continue forward in their academics, and they start thinking, if I have an opportunity to challenge myself, take a risk, and maybe not be as successful initially, or simply stay the course, do what I'm told, and just be really good at regurgitating information, I should choose regurgitating information. And unfortunately, that's the pathway a lot of our kids are moving in. And obviously, it comes with a lot of stress and anxiety, but from the society's perspective, it's not creating the future leaders of our society that we really need, the ones that are willing to think creatively and are comfortable doing so.
How it's tailored is that risk-free environment. And I would say that's the biggest thing that's changed. Even when you were in the program, you guys had no problem taking risks. In fact, you liked it, and you were encouraged by it. A lot of the perfectionism and the way that, maybe home pushes that, depending on, their upbringing, the wanting to always be right and not feeling okay with being wrong and taking chances. That's the big change I've seen than when you were in. You guys loved taking chances, and it's kind of a non-ceiling where now the kids are a little bit more hesitant to take those risks because they don't want to be wrong.
This is how Brzezinski tries to combat that mentality in her own class.
Well, I let them know when I screw up, because that's plenty of times. So I think just showing them that it's human, and then I also give a lot of examples of people that tried, risk-taking goes hand in hand with having grit and perseverance. So you've all heard the Abraham Lincoln story, how many times he was defeated, and and how people told Einstein he was crazy. Crazy good is what he was, but just real world examples, and that it's kind of that little choo-choo train. I know that we talk about it. I can. You just have to let them know that it's not always going to be easy. And here's the crazy thing is when I tell the kids, you are going to fail, and they look at me like, my teachers told me I'm going to fail. What's that? Well, because it's reality. There's going to be a time you're going to hit a wall. Everybody has it. Just those people I talked to you did, multiple walls. So I think the way you encourage that is just to show them your real world examples, show people that overcame those obstacles, and then also showing them that I'm human.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Testing Boundaries. Look out for new episodes on peshprince.com, and make sure to follow @peshprince on Twitter for the latest in school, local, and world news.